Chapter 7, Skeletal System, Appendicular Skeleton or Appendicular Division. These are the bones of the upper and lower limbs and the girdles through which these bones are attached to the axial skeleton. So remember, the axial skeleton is the central portion of the skeleton: skull, vertebral column, thoracic cage or rib cage. And then the appendicular skeleton, think of it as the skeleton of the appendages, arms and legs, upper and lower appendages, and their respective girdles: pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle. And then the axial skeleton, of course, I just mentioned. In total, 126 bones in the appendicular skeleton. Most of them are the carpals in your wrists, and the tarsals in the ankles. So let's move to the upper limb and its pectoral girdle. That includes the clavicle, which we actually don't see here, but that's the clavicle here, your collarbone. And then the scapula, the humerus, bone of your upper arm, radius and ulna, bones of the forearm. The radius is always lateral. Notice it's towards the thumb. This limb is in the anatomical position. It's the right limb, upper limb. And then the ulna, slightly thinner. It is medial towards the body, towards the pinky. Then the carpals are the wrist bones. There's 8 of them. The metacarpals are the bones within the fleshy portion of your palm. And then the phalanges, or the digits, are your fingers, including finger 1, which is the thumb. Okay, let's move on to the clavicle. You just need to know the sternal and the acromial ends. So the sternal end is towards the sternum. Going the wrong direction here. Sternal end towards the manubrium on the sternum, your breastbone, and then curves anterior, then curves posteriorly, and then the acromial end articulates with the acromion, which is a bony protrusion on the scapula. All right, and then this is the inferior view. So those are the only things you need to know about the clavicle. It's sternal end or medial end, acromial end or lateral end towards the shoulder joint. Okay, so there you go. There's the manubrium on the sternum. There's the sternal end of the individual's left clavicle. And then there's the acromial end of that clavicle, and it articulates with the acromion of the scapula. Moving on to the scapula, a number of structures here. One is the spine. So posterior view here of the right scapula, and that's the spine of the scapula, which you can feel quite easily. The acromion, again, is this protuberance that articulates with the clavicle. Then we have 3 borders. Lateral border, medial border, and then the superior border on your scapula. So posterior view here, let's flip it around and look at the anterior view for, so this is looking at the front of the scapula, the right one. And then this is a lateral view from the right side of the right scapula as well. There's the acromion here and here, coming off of the spine. This depression here is the glenoid cavity or fossa that articulates with the head of the humerus, forming that articulation at the shoulder joint. The coracoid process is here. Here, notice that juts out anteriorly, coracoid. We'll find out later that there's a coronoid process on the ulna. So one way to keep this straight, hopefully, the coracoid, there's a C in coracoid, an extra C, and then the bone is the scapula. So scapula with the C, coracoid with that extra C. Let me see here. Oh yeah, so that glenoid cavity or fossa here, that kind of shallow depression, forms the articulating surface with the head of the humerus at our shoulder joint. There's the acromion articulating with the clavicle, and that's the coracoid process. And the upper limb is highly movable, mobile. The scapula floats on the back of the thoracic cage. Very movable. Technically, this is a ball and socket joint, but one reason why you have such a huge range of motion with your shoulder, upper arm, it's because the entire upper limb articulates with the axial skeleton at one point, which is a little hard to see from the back here, but that one point is the articulation with the sternal end of the clavicle with the manubrium on the sternum, just there. The rest of this does not articulate with the axial skeleton. So that's kind of like the hinge point, which is why there's such a huge range of motion with our upper limb and the scapula. Okay, let's move on to that upper arm bone, the humerus. Boom. So a lot of structures here on the humerus. Many of them, you only need to know what I have listed on here, which should correspond with our lab work. There's the head, nice round head of the humerus, which articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. There's the capitulum. So this is, the head is part of the proximal epiphysis of this long bone, the humerus. If we go down to the distal epiphysis, there's something called the capitulum down here. This is the anterior view, that's a posterior view. Excuse me. There's the capitulum there, capitulum here. The capitulum articulates with the round head of the radius at our elbow joint. Then there's something called the trochlea, which is down here, kind of this groove here, and kind of like a spindle in a way, or like a pulley, but this groove, the trochlea, articulates with the trochlear notch on the ulna, the other bone of the forearm, again at the elbow joint. Then there's the coronoid fossa, which is the anterior aspect of the humerus, this somewhat shallow depression, and then on the posterior distal end of the humerus, there's a deeper depression. It's called the olecranon fossa. So the coronoid fossa is there to accommodate what's called the coronoid process on the ulna, and the olecranon fossa fits the olecranon or the olecranon process on the ulna as well. So we'll see that in a couple of minutes. So that helps accommodate the ulna when you flex your arm at the elbow and or extend the arm at the elbow. And then there's epicondyles, these ridges here. There's the lateral and medial epicondyle. So notice the head has to articulate with the scapula medially towards the body. That means this is the medial epicondyle. And then on the opposite side, that's the lateral epicondyle. Okay? Right? Okay. And this is the right humerus. So the shoulder joint here, the body's this way. That means that's laterally, so there's a lateral epicondyle. Right? Epi meaning kind of on top of the condyles. And the condyles distally on the humerus have been modified, and they're given these names, capitulum and trochlea. And the capitulum is lateral, and the trochlea is medial, okay, relative to each other. Moving to the radius and the ulna. So this would be the shoulder joint. Sorry, this would be the elbow joint. The humerus would be proximal, closer to the body. The radius and ulna would be distal, closer to the wrist and the hand. All right. So this is the right side, the right radius and ulna in the anatomical position. Again, lots of structures. The only ones you need to know on the ulna, which is this one, is the olecranon, sometimes called the olecranon process, but the olecranon that fits when your arm is extended, elbow's extended, that olecranon process or that olecranon fits into the olecranon fossa. And on the other side, the coronoid fossa on the humerus accommodates, here we go, the coronoid process on the ulna. So coronoid with an N, ulna with an N. Okay? Remember the scapula with the C has the coracoid process. Trochlear notch. So this is the notch on the ulna that fits the trochlea on the humerus. Then distally, down here, there's a little bony protrusion, and that's called the ulnar styloid process because it's on the ulna, and that helps form the articulation at the wrist with the carpals. Okay, that's it for the ulna. On the radius, the head is proximal and it's round. Okay, so the round head on the radius. And then distally, there's another bony protrusion that's bigger than the ulnar styloid process, but that's the radial styloid process here. And again, the two styloid processes help form the joint at the wrist with the carpals. And we'll talk about these joints and how they move when we do articulations in the next chapter. Okay? So this ulna, if you flip it to the side, look at it from the side laterally, it has a very obvious trochlear notch and the olecranon here, or olecranon process, and the coronoid process here. And it's kind of like a U-shaped structure. So I tell students, notice the U, don't forget the U on the ulna, because the ulna has a U on it. Okay? And then the round R radius, the round head R on the radius R. Okay, and zooming into the elbow joint, posterior view, anterior view. This is the olecranon that fits into the deeper olecranon fossa. And anterior view, there's a coronoid process that fits into the shallower coronoid fossa. And notice posterior view, right, of the right elbow. So then that would be the round head of the radius. The radius is lateral, ulna is medial, and the round head of the radius articulates with the capitulum of the humerus, which is not labeled here, but it's labeled over here. Capitulum of the humerus articulates with the round head of the radius. Okay? And that's your elbow joint. So the bony part of your elbow, like if you hit your elbow on a table or something, that's the olecranon of the ulna. And this is looking at the anterior view of the right elbow joint. And notice how where's my cursor? Here we go. How the radius kind of rotates over the ulna when you flip your hand over. So if you have your hand straight out, palm up, which is this diagram, this figure at the beginning, the radius is parallel to the ulna. But if you flip your hand over, but hold your elbow stationary, if you flip your hand over so that your palm is facing downward, that action occurs because the radius rotates over the ulna, because this is a pivot joint between the radius and the ulna. However, the radius and ulna together form a hinge joint at the elbow. So it's kind of a nice, neat, complicated joint, the elbow joint.